Hello, and welcome to Chapter 16 of Menace in the Goldilocks Zone. We're almost through. As you recall, if you've been following along, that our motley band has been in the market for a larger vessel, and it so turns out that an Arborean chieftain happens to have a very large vessel with a very large hold that will include the freighter, will fit the freighter, but he is asking an unreasonable amount for it. He wants to captain it. So that is how we left our band, and this is how we left the book last time. I must think about your proposal, Forgedem responds, as the success of our expedition will hinge on our ability to work together. Give me a night to sleep on it. Agreed, Broadtrunk says. You're sure you won't just take the nectar gel and sea salt instead? Roger asks Broadtrunk. We will need the proceeds from that to buy fuel and supplies, Broadtrunk replies. So yes, I am sure. Just thought I'd ask, Roger says. All right. So now we begin Chapter 16, Combative Deference and Contentious Agreement. The next morning brings rain from the mountains, so the crew takes their morning meal in the galley of the freighter. Forgedem had briefed the crew on the Rotvine the night before, so the meal is eaten in silent expectation of her decision. Roger distracts himself by counting how often his goggles register the sound of thunder. Nowardam, Burrowson breaks the silence. Is the vessel properly grounded? Yes, sir, the second officer replies. Standard procedure. Well done, Burrowson says, and except for the peals of thunder, silence descends again. Have you found a buyer for your nectar wine, Larderson? Roger asks, eventually bored with counting thunderclaps. No, sir. We, that is Gatherdam and me, we decided not to sell, the crewman replies. Yes, Gatherdam interjects. It seems to be quite useful, so we decided to keep it for use during the voyage. That's very selfless of you, Forgedam observes approvingly, speaking for the first time that morning. Yes, she says thoughtfully. This voyage is more important than any of our individual self-interests. She looks pointedly at the two crew persons. Thank you, Gatherdem, Watterson, for reminding me of that. You're welcome, ma'am? The two murmur in confusion. You're all wondering if I have come to a decision regarding Broadtrunk's offer, the captain continues. And after a long night, I did reach a decision. And that is, Peregrine prompts. That was that we take our chances in the freighter, Forgedem replies. I thought that a shared command was too fraught, had too much potential for conflict when we needed to act as a unified team. I considered the folly, or should I say the Rotvine, a luxury, a distraction from our true mission. So I was prepared to argue that we should decline Broadtrunk's offer. But you're not anymore. It was Roger's turn to prompt. No, Forgedem admits, I'm not. Lauderson and Gatherdam reminded me that each and every one of us has contributed something to our purpose at a critical juncture. Take the Admiral, for example. When I first met him, I considered him animated cargo, a person I needed simply to get from one point to another. He has since proven an adept ambassador, as Broadtrunk described him, and because of him we have the goodwill, if not the full understanding, of their Radiant patrols. Burrowson has provided key contacts on Mare Urba. Nowardam has kept her cool in the cockpit during those critical times when Burrowson and I couldn't be there. Forwardson, as I understand it, was the one who found Rotvine, which gave us an in with Broadtrunk, who now offers us his services. No, we cannot afford to let pride jeopardize our purpose, especially when we can have the help of someone as thoughtful, insightful, and perceptive as Broadtrunk. Does that mean we're saying yes? Forgedem asks. Speaking of insightful and perceptive, Burrowson notes Riley. Yes, that's what it means, Forreston replies after giving Burrowson a dark look. I suppose the thing to do is go tell him myself. Yes, I suppose so, Roger agrees. Then a realization dawns. Oh, he notes morosely. That means we need to hire the 3 simpletons again. The storm passes and Roger and the captain venture out to find transportation. The sun climbs high and much of the rain is already evaporated by the time they find who they are looking for, stretched out on their transport, basking in the sun. Is the chieftain expecting you? A dubious Treevine asks. Yes, Shadeleaf echoes. Is he expecting you? The chieftain hates unexpected visitors, Greenbark adds. The chieftain is indeed expecting us this morning, Roger replies patiently. So may we leave now, while it is still morning? Roger's sarcasm is predictably lost on the trio, who spend the next few minutes bickering over whether there's enough of the morning left to get Roger and the captain to Broadtrunks before midday. In the end, Treevine exercises executive power and declares that there is, so the 2 Outworlders climb aboard and they set off. The route they take from the spaceport is, much to Roger's consternation, identical to the one they took with Strongbow. Isn't there a more direct way of getting to Broadtrunks? Roger asks impatiently. We seem to be meandering about a great deal. That's what the streets do, Treevine replies. They meander. You can take a more direct route on foot, Shadeleaf adds, but it will take you longer. And you will probably get lost, Greenbark chimes in cheerfully. In that case, Roger tells them resignedly, carry on. As it happens, the sun is directly overhead by the time they arrive at their destination. Greenbark insists on announcing them and is off the transport before Roger can protest. By the time he has extricated himself from the transport, Stout Branch is at the door. The chieftain will receive you and hopes you have not had your midday meal, Stout Branch reports. He also advises that you dismiss your transport as he will return you to the spaceport personally. The 3 simpletons petulantly receive the news that they will have to return to their usual duties at the spaceport and drive off sniping derisively about the propriety of our chieftain ferrying Outworlders about like a common transport worker, evidently overlooking the fact that they are common transport workers. Stout Branch leads them toward the back of the house, past the cage-like lift, and outside to a courtyard or atrium where Broadtrunks' household staff can be seen assembling a table and chairs and setting out bowls of fruit and flasks of beverages. The chieftain himself is supervising the preparations with an evident air of impatience, but once they are complete, he declares them satisfactory and thanks his staff. Only then does he greet his guests. Good day, Admiral, Captain, he says, ushering them to the table. Thank you for joining me, as I am very glad to see you both. He stops as if something has just occurred to him. Our friend Peregrine is not joining us? Sorry, I forgot to do the voice. She sends her apologies, Roger improvises. I believe she felt her presence would be distracting to your staff. I see, Broadtrunk replies, still obviously disappointed. I understand her reasons, I do, but I cannot help but think her absence is an indication of your decision. But to that after our meal, he adds more jovially. I'm sure the captain has noticed that we offer only the scarlet and orange fruits in her honor. No, I hadn't, Forreston admits to Roger after hearing his translation. But please tell the chieftain that it is a lovely gesture and much appreciated. The 3 take their places at the table and Broadtrunk distributes fruit and flasks. I have not learned of your preferences, Admiral, the chieftain says as he's about to fill Roger's plate. I have none, Roger replies truthfully. The 3 eat in silence for a few minutes, but it is clear that neither Forreston nor Broadtrunk have an appetite, while the purpose of their visit hangs over them like one of the morning's storm clouds. Admiral, Forreston says at last, would you be so kind as to translate for the chieftain as accurately as possible exactly what I say from this point on? Well, yes, Roger says, puzzled. Of course. Chieftain Broadtrunk, Forreston begins. I have asked the Admiral here to faithfully translate my every word. She pauses here to let Roger do so. It may seem odd that I would express my wishes in that way, she continues, and here looks pointedly at Roger. But even with my scant Arborian, it has not escaped my attention that Mr. Roger, in his role as our ambassador, often sees fit to use more diplomatic language in his translations. For his part, Roger casts her an annoyed look but dutifully complies with an exact translation. I point this out, Forged M continues, because if we are going to work together, we can have no blunting of points or ambiguity in our communications. It takes less than a second for Broadtrunk to realize the implication of Forged M's remark, once translated, and he visibly relaxes. I quite concur, Captain, he says, for even with goodwill on all sides, the difficulties we outlined last evening remain. Yes, she replies, and the first step in addressing those difficulties is coming to an agreement on what they are. Language is obviously one, Roger interjects in both languages after translating Forged M's comment. Yes, Broadtrunk agrees with amusement. We can hardly expect the Admiral here to be available at all hours. We might expect it, Forged M observes wryly, but I agree. It does not seem to be a realistic expectation. It would seem the only solution is that one learns the other's language, Roger observes, twice over. Or, Forged M counters, that each learns the other's language. An excellent suggestion, Broadtrunk agrees. That apportions the burden equally. Shall we resolve that after a few days of preparation that we address the other in his or her own language? It may take more than a few days, Forged M cautions. I don't know that I am the student of languages that the chieftain seems to be. I may have been overly optimistic in the way I put that, Broadtrunk admits, but we have several days of work to do on the Rotvine before we can leave in any case. That leaves the issue of command, Forged M observes, and I must say that after giving the issue much thought, the proposition of joint captainhood, as it were, is too unwieldy to be workable. She pauses to allow Roger to translate. Let me ask you, are you planning to bring any of your own people with you? Broadtrunk appears startled by the question. No, he replies. I thought my demands unreasonable enough. That reassures me, Forged M says in reply. As I said, I have given this issue a great deal of thought, and have concluded that our enterprise is far more important than my pride. She pauses to allow Roger to translate. I will accept the role of first officer so to avoid conflict and confusion. Broadtrunk is visibly moved and distressed by the announcement. Captain, he says humbly, I too have given this a great deal of thought, and have come to the opposite conclusion for the same reasons, that I should accept second in command. Oh, Dreadspawn and Tidal Surge, Roger exclaims in frustration. You two are like farmers on water, quibbling in combative deference, locked in contentious agreement. He must have made the remark in Arborian as Broadtrunk grins and Forged M looks confused. Roger feels obligated to repeat the remark for her, and she too makes an expression Roger recognizes as wry amusement. Then what then does the ambassador propose? The captain asks in her gently sardonic way. I say we put the question in front of the full leadership council, Roger says, which of course includes Broadtrunk. You mean let Peregrine decide, Forged M says dubiously. No, I do not, Roger replies testily. Unlike the two of you, I have not given this a great deal of thought, as I did not realize until now that I had any part in the decision. I cannot speak for Peregrine, but I do think she deserves a say. The exchange had taken place rapidly in Mare Urban, so Roger now has to bring Broadtrunk up to date. I must say I find that an excellent suggestion, Broadtrunk admits, as whatever we decide will have an effect on everyone. Shall we reconvene at the spaceport this evening? Will that be enough time for you to consider the matter? For me, yes, Roger replies. As I say, I cannot speak for Peregrine, but we can at least brief her on the current state of things in the meantime. Good, Broadtrunk remarks. Now I believe I can finish my meal. I don't know about the two of you, but I suddenly have an appetite. The meal continues with Foragedem grilling Broadtrunk on the technical aspects of the Rottwein through Roger, which doesn't impede his eating at all because, of course, he doesn't talk with his mouth. From the conversation, Roger gathers that the two agree, among other things, that the freighter would be used to ferry fuel to the Rottwein and serve as a fuel reserve. He also learns that the vessel they had used to visit the Rottwein is actually a shuttle, part of the larger vessel's complement. It seems in acquiring the Rottwein, they acquire two vessels, not just one. The technical conversation continues on the ride back to the spaceport and begins to tax Roger's concentration. He gains some insight to how the translation device works as a result. Evidently, Roger's conversation translates into the last language used, unless he looks at or hears a person of another species. He has to be careful, therefore, to look at the person he is addressing or translating for. It also strikes him that the question of rank being deferred, the two rivals in humility are apparently able to discuss matters freely and question one another's opinions and conclusions without inciting resentment or rancor. He wonders, not idly, whether the whole question can be deferred indefinitely. He makes just that suggestion once he and Foragedem have briefed Peregrine on their discussions with Broadtrunk, and the captain excuses herself to dig up my old Arborian primer and get to studying. It would seem on the face of things to be the ideal solution, Peregrine agrees, but I suspect the arrangement would collapse in a time of crisis. She pauses thoughtfully for a moment. Given that, what do you think? Or have you formed an opinion? I have, Roger replies, surprising himself. Foragedem has been our captain and remains so. I must confess that I agree with you, Peregrine nods. Let's hope that Broadtrunk is sincere in his humility. Roger returns to his scathing indictment of Arborian society on canvas, only to find his experience with Broadtrunk has softened his contempt. He need only recall the three simpletons, however, and he's inspired anew. The shadows grow long, the light fades, and Roger puts aside his paints. He had been able to concentrate on his work, which was a welcome respite from the previous days of uncertainty. There is still uncertainty to resolve, he reminds himself, but having settled the question in his own mind, he felt less anxiety. He seeks Gatherdam and the freighter, but it is Foragedem that he finds. Hello, Foragedem. Is there any Arborian fruit left? Broadtrunk will be joining us for the evening meal again. And on our journey, Foragedem replies. The captain briefed us this afternoon. I believe we have some of the yellow left. No one seems to like it. Oh, good, Roger says. Have you seen Lutterson about? I believe he's with Gatherdam, sir. In her cabin? Yes, sir. That's this way, if I recall, Roger says, about to move off. Sir? Foragedem stops him. I wouldn't disturb them just yet. Oh? Roger asks, puzzled. Why not? They're having a private conversation, the crewman explains, clearly uncomfortable. Oh? Roger asks again. Is everything all right? Oh, quite all right, sir, I can assure you. They just need some time together. Alone. Undisturbed. Oh, I see, Roger says, even though he doesn't. Would you tell Larderson, if you see him, that some nectar wine would be lovely at mealtime tonight? I'll tell him, sir. Thank you. Until this evening, then. Roger leaves the freighter, puzzling over Foragedem's behavior. There's clearly something going on between Gatherdam and Larderson, but just as clearly it is not that which makes Foragedem uncomfortable. It is talking about it that makes him uncomfortable. Roger ponders a moment longer and puts it out of his mind. As long as he could spend with them, he concludes, he would probably never completely understand Mare Urbans. Broadtrunk arrives at sunset, bearing gifts of scarlet and orange fruit. Roger greets him, and together they walk to the dining table, where Peregrine has lit the now traditional torches to light their meal, and the crew has assembled. A delicious night to your bodies all, Broadtrunk says in greeting, causing some confused looks on the Mare Urbans. Didn't I say that right? Broadtrunk looks to Roger. What you said right, but Roger turns to the Mayor Urbans. What should the chieftain have said? A good evening to you all, Nourdam replies, carefully enunciating her words. A good evening to you all, Broadtrunk repeats just as carefully. Then to Roger, what did I say to them? Nothing shameful, he assures the chieftain, just odd. At this point, Foragedom appears. Exaltations and obesity, O chieftain mine, is her greeting, to which Broadtrunk replies, A good evening to you all. Roger looks at Peregrine, who has arrived with Foragedom, and sees an expression to match the pain he is feeling. Perhaps, Roger observes, we should continue in Mayor Urban in deference to the crew, with translations to Arborean by Peregrine and myself, of course. Both Broadtrunk and Foragedom appear relieved by the suggestion. Peregrine, the captain, Roger, and Broadtrunk all join the crew at the table, whereupon Peregrine picks up the flask before her and holds it up. Let us all welcome our newest crewmate and ally, Chief Broadtrunk. Everyone but Roger, of course, picks up a flask and drinks as Roger translates. Gratuity, gratuity, Broadtrunk says to the amusement of the Mayor Urbans, at which he adds evidently in Arborean, I thank you all for your warm welcome. Before we eat, Foragedom says as Roger translates, I think we should take a lesson from our midday meal and decide the question at hand so we can all enjoy the meal. Once again, Broadtrunk responds, the captain and I are in perfect agreement. In that case, Peregrine says, if the two of you will indulge us with your understanding of the question and a summary of your arguments for your position. As our guest, not our guest, Peregrine corrects herself, but as our newest comrade, I suggest Broadtrunk state his position first. Well, as to our understanding of the question, I know the captain and I to be in complete agreement, Broadtrunk begins as Roger translates. A vessel cannot have two captains. As in concert as we seem to be now, disagreements will inevitably arise, and most probably in crisis when swift decisions and swift actions will be required. For that reason, and the fact that she is thoroughly acquainted with our crew, I argue that I should, for the sake of the important work we need to do, defer to the captain's authority. Well, it's settled then, Burleson says after Roger's translation. Let's eat. No, Foragedom says, it is not. The chieftain is right. We agree on the nature of the problem, but we disagree on the solution. Yes, I am familiar with the crew, but I am a stranger to the Rotvine. Captain, crew, and vessel must be as one if we are to succeed. For that reason I argue that I should be the one to defer authority to Broadtrunk. An uneasy silence settles over the table after Peregrine translates the captain's remarks. Roger looks around the table. Both Broadtrunk and Foragedom wear expressions of determination according to the customs of their people. The Mayor Urban crew, to a person, appears confused and anxious. Roger looks to Peregrine, who wears a pensive but calm expression. He catches her eye, and she nods to him. As Broadtrunk noted last evening, Roger observes, we have a leadership team which he, by virtue of his contribution, now joins. We agreed earlier today to put the matter before the leadership team and abide by that decision. Am I correct in that understanding? Foragedom indicates that he is, as does Peregrine and Broadtrunk, once Peregrine translates the question for him. Good, Roger acknowledges. For my part, I find the arguments on both sides cogent and compelling, but weighed on the scale of my judgment, I find in favor of Broadtrunk's position. As do I, Peregrine adds after translating for Broadtrunk, and I must say we are fortunate to have such a choice put before us. Wait, Foragedom says, that means the captain is still the captain, right? Yes, Foragedom replies, it appears I am outvoted, that is, unless Broadtrunk has changed his mind. No, the chieftain replies, without waiting for the question to be translated, I hold to my position. Well, Burleson says gamely, holding up his flask, to our new first officer. The translation appears to cause Broadtrunk some embarrassment. It has never been my intention to displace anyone, he says as Roger translates, only to augment what you already have. Mr. Burleson here has doubtless achieved his position through hard work and diligence. I'm reluctant to take it from him. I suggest the rank of executive officer for myself. Agreed, the assembled responded simultaneously once the suggestion had been translated. All right then, Burrowson says, raising his flask once again, to our new executive officer. So that ends chapter 16. Next, chapter 17 is called Encounter with a Giant. What's that about? Thanks very much for listening and watching. If you have comments, suggestions, criticism, smartass remarks, leave them in the comment section at Fedora Fiction Facebook page. Thanks for watching and listening.